trip to New York, I found myself stuck out in Queens in a bargain hotel for several long evenings. My hotel TV had only about a dozen channels, most of which were devoted to sports. And there were only two news channels, and you know I'm a news junkie. One of them was CNN, which I commonly refer to as a complete waste of time. And the other one was one that I had never seen before, RT, Russian television. RT is apparently a sort of Voice of America in reverse, with British and American accented reporters covering the day's news, often from a distinctly Russian perspective, but often gloating about how some of their stories that they are willing to tell Western audiences are about news events that are not going to be covered in our media. Things like the fact that CNN had recently accepted a bribe from the royal family of Bahrain to not report on human rights abuses in Bahrain, a story which you didn't see on CNN, but if you research it on the internet, you will find that it is true. You may not be much inclined to believe what might be propaganda from Russia, but I checked out several of the stories and was surprised to see that they were doing a much better job of reporting world news than CNN was. Corporate-owned news agencies are often colossal failures when it comes to actually providing us with the news. They are largely entertainment sources that should not be relied upon for anything other than sports scores. And since I know nothing about sports, I can't even tell you that their sports scores are accurate, but I trust that they are reliable. You can, however, watch broadcast news to plumb the psyche of American culture and learn about American prejudices, because the way TV reports news is actually rather telling about the way that we think. There's a wonderful program called Counterspin. It's a radio program. You can't get it in our area, surprise, surprise. You can, however, download it off of the internet. It's a 30-minute weekly program that provides an analysis of what was on the corporate news, that is the counterspin, that tries to give you insights into just exactly how you've been lied to in the preceding 7 days. In a recent program, they pointed out how we tend to talk about death on the battlefield. In a recent ABC report aired by David Muir earlier this month, he said, and I quote, "Overseas now to Afghanistan, and a stark reminder of the human costs of war." Now, whenever you hear someone on ABC or CBS or NBC or Fox or other American news agencies talking about the human cost of war, you can bet that they are going to talk about American deaths. That's about all they call human. And sure enough, Muir's report was about the 2,000th American soldier to die in Afghanistan without a single mention of how many Afghanis had died in that war virtually every day. 2 weeks earlier, the same network ran a story about a NATO airstrike that had killed 8 Afghan women who were out gathering firewood to cook at their family homes. This was described as an incident that was causing tension. The year before, ABC reported on a drone strike that killed 9 Afghan children who were just out playing. That was mentioned in an ABC News report only as a means of introducing how Afghan President Hamid Karzai had had harsh words of criticism for drone strikes in his country. Words do matter, folks. The choice of words indicate how we unconsciously feel about things. Now, sometimes when it comes to the news media, I don't know if it's a chicken or the egg. I don't know if they are just reflecting our prejudices back to us or if they are, in fact, educating us to be prejudiced. Are they just telling us that women and children in Afghanistan, when they die, it's an incident, and when Americans die, it's a human tragedy, only because they cannot possibly appear to be critical of a war that is funding corporate profits? There is a similarly subtle wording issue in our gospel lesson that Cecily read for us a moment ago. And I don't know if Mark intentionally worded it this way or if it was just a reflection of how the culture had preserved the story of this blind man. But in this pericope, Jesus encounters a blind man who is called, in the text, Bartimeaus. In fact, Mark shows how little he actually knows about Palestinian Jewish culture when he says that Jesus encountered Bartimeaus, the son of Timeaus, because Bartimeaus means son of Timeaus. They didn't have family names the way that we do. Rather, people were known by their first name and then the name of their father. And sometimes, for good measure, they would name their father's father and his father. In that culture, I would be called Roger, son of Teddy, son of John, or in Aramaic, Roger ben Teddy ben John. The point is, whether Mark was conscious of it or not when he wrote it down, it appears that no one bothered to give this blind man a name. He wasn't Matthew, son of Timeaus. He was just the blind man, the son of Timeaus. On several occasions, as a clergyman, it has been my responsibility to sit with a couple who had just experienced the loss of a pregnancy, a miscarriage. And there are miscarriages that happen so early that the fetal material is simply discarded. But if the pregnancy is farther along, the family might want to hold a funeral. At least once I presided over a funeral when the miscarriage had occurred at a point where the couple felt that there needed to be a graveside service, there needed to be a burial. But they didn't regard that fetus as being a person, so they did not give it a name. I think we see something like that at work in this text, because Bartimeaus was not a whole person. He wasn't quite a person. And the neighbors, the villagers, didn't bother to call him by a name because he had a serious disability. I want to believe that his parents did at some point name him. I hope they did. But folks, you know how parents can be sometimes. Maybe they didn't. Maybe they didn't want to think about it. Maybe they didn't want to talk about him. Maybe he wasn't of much use to them, because in that culture, your social security was your son's. And having a blind son was a liability. He wasn't able to work. He was just a beggar. I want to think that we're better about it in the 21st century, that we wouldn't let a person with a serious disability be so cut off from society. But in that era, when they couldn't work in the fields, they couldn't build a house, they couldn't make furniture, they also couldn't get married, wouldn't have kids. They couldn't lead in the religious community. Whether he had a name or not, what we can be sure of is that he just didn't count for much. He wasn't quite a person. And indeed, we might say that he needed to be saved. Now, I hope you don't mind me using that word in a progressive church, but that's actually the word that's in the Bible. It's not how it's translated, but that's what's actually in the Greek. Modern English translations usually render it, go, your faith has made you well, in this particular text. But the same word in Greek that says, go, your faith has made you well, when Jesus says it to the sinful woman in the house of Simon the Pharisee, it's translated, go, your faith has saved you. And Bible translators assume then that salvation means that you get to go to heaven when you die, and that if what you're receiving is curing of an illness, well, then you're being made well. But the word salvation in Greek actually means to be made whole. So wherever you're broken, whether you can't walk or you can't see or you can't hear, or you are defined, as this woman in Simon the Pharisee's house was. She was defined as a sinful woman. Whatever keeps you from being in society, wherever you are broken, that's what salvation means. To be made whole, to be restored to society, to be allowed to re-enter family and the religious community. Blindness in the Bible often represents something other than literally not being able to see. Blindness often represents what we mean by the proverb that none are so blind as those who refuse to see. Blindness is oftentimes an intentional ignorance. Scott Peck says that one of the best working definitions of evil is intentional ignorance, the intent to not understand, to not see. We use gossip and slander to tear a person down so that we can justify dismissing them, removing them from society, doing them great personal harm. We dehumanize gay people so that we can deny them the right to marry, to inherit, to have health care, to adopt within their own families, the same way that straight people do every day of the week without ever thinking about it. We scream about deporting illegal aliens from their own ancestral lands that we just happen to have stolen from them at the point of a bayonet. I cannot imagine why so many Americans go to New Mexico and look around and say, how come there's so many Mexicans here? Look at the name of the state. Do you think Colorado, do you think Arizona are English words? Come on. They are just going home. Yes, it is horrible. It is horrible that 2,000 American soldiers have lost their lives fighting in Afghanistan over the past 11 years. But men and women, do you even know how many people have died in Mexico in this civil war that's going on there? Do you know? It's a war that is being funded by the American market for illegal drugs. It is being armed by gun shops along the border of the United States and Mexico. In Mexico, do you know how many legal gun shops there are? One. You know how many there are along the border on the United States side? 6,000. Wow. 6,000. So we are creating the trade and we are providing the arms. And in less than half the time that those 2,000 American soldiers have died in Afghanistan, in just the last 5 years, in Mexico, in that war, between 50 and 60,000 Mexicans have been killed. Why do you suppose our corporate media never talks about it? But we do know other things. Our news media does tell us some things. We know that Jessica Simpson is on a diet trying to lose the baby fat that she gained. We know that the Twilight star, Kristen Stewart, had an affair and that it will affect the sales of the next Twilight movie, which I see as a good thing. We can give a tremendous amount of network news time for Donald Trump to make a complete fool of himself and devote hours of hand-wringing over whether Lance Armstrong may have used steroids to overcome cancer and become the world's fastest cyclist for 7 consecutive years. Congratulations, Lance Armstrong. But 50,000 deaths on our doorstep, hardly a word. You are more likely to hear about Lindsay Lohan's next DUI charge, and I suspect there will be one, than the deaths of tens of thousands of citizens within a day's drive of Brownsville, Texas. Now, do you have any idea why that's true? Now, I think there has been a recent exception to this rule of media silence and anonymity. And that exception has a name that I'll tell you honestly, I don't even feel qualified to say it out loud. Malala Yousufza, 14-year-old Pakistani girl who was shot in the head by a Taliban assassin while she was on a school bus on her way home from school. She's become a familiar image in the news even before she was a victim of this horrible attempt on her life. She'd become a spokesperson for advocating for access for education for girls in her native Pakistan. But more than that, she had demanded full rights for women to be able to go outside and play with friends, to be able to go to the marketplace when she wanted to be able to sing if she chose to sing, or to speak her mind in public. She was asked by a reporter last year, but what would you say to a young girl who is not as brave as you are, who doesn't want to risk going to school or the market, who wants to remain safe in her room. And Malala said, I would tell her, you cannot just stay in your room, because on the day of judgment, God will ask you, where were you when your people were calling for you? When your people were being blown up, when they were being killed, where were you when your people needed you? Now, you guys know me, I'm not real big on that judgment day thing, not because I eschew the notion of a great final judgment at the end of time, but my own beliefs are that judgment is much more imminent. I think the day of judgment comes every single day. So where were you when Malala was shot? Where were you when you refused to restrict the sale of military weapons, even along the border of Mexico, when we know that there's a civil war raging there? Where were you when Missouri passed an amendment to the Constitution forbidding same-sex marriage? Where were you when the church told you to stay out of politics and just worry about making sure that your soul goes to heaven, while your neighbors were being evicted from their homes, refused medical care, losing their unemployment assistance, or being trapped in payday loans with interest rates of nearly 2,000%? There are no partial people. There are no almost humans. There are no disposable people. They all have a name. And the deaths of the innocents is never an incident if their skin is brown or if they speak another language. You will not often know their names, but men and women, I adjure you, you must never diminish their humanity. Now, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, because I think guilt is the most useless emotion in the world. What I am trying to say to you is what this lion says to you every week: thou shalt not stand idly by. I'm not worried about God judging me at the end of my life. I just want to live in a way so that if Malala ever hears about us, that she'll be proud of us. And when we do die, and we will, I hope that we will have lived in such a way that Westboro Baptist Church will come and protest at the funeral.
So why do you risk your life to raise your voice?
Because I thought that my people need me, and I shall raise my voice, because if I didn't raise my voice now, so when will I raise my voice?
Some people might say you're 14. You don't have any rights. You just have to listen to mom and dad.
No, I have rights. I have the right of education. I have the right to play. I have the right to sing. I have the right to talk. I have the right to go to market. I have the right to speak up.
Well, what if you give that advice to a girl who may not be as courageous as you, and she says, Malala, I'm afraid. I just want to stay in my room.
So I'll tell her that don't stay in your room, because God will ask you on the day of judgment that where were you when your people were asking you, when your school fellows were asking you, and when your school was asking you that I am being blown up. When your people need you, you should come up, you should come, and you should stand up for their rights.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.